Any post-war peace must be a peace without victory. Victory would mean peace forced upon the loser, a victor's term imposed upon the vanquished. It would be accepted in humiliation, under duress, at an intolerable sacrifice, and would leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory upon which terms of peace would rest not permanently, but only upon quicksand. Only a peace between equals can last. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, 1917.
The year is 1920. World War I has officially ended, with the final post-war treaties being signed. Both Germany and the United States had been utterly humiliated, as the victors of the war attained all the spoils. The shape of the world, and especially the North American continent, had been changed, and the Confederate States, along with the United Kingdom, were now one of the unquestioned powers of the world. The CS managed to gain a large foothold in the Caribbean thanks to the acquisition of Davis and the Yucatan, basically seizing control of all the trade that went through it. And thanks to the completion of the Panama Canal in the spring of 1923, they had easy access to the Pacific, improving ties with the Japanese. The Confederacy also managed to gain somewhat decent relations with California and Deseret. Overseas, the Confederate colony of Fredonia also saw some expansion into the former German territories thanks to the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty also allowed the CS to receive German Namibia. The Commonwealth of Namibia would soon be turned into a somewhat Confederate penal colony. A lot was happening elsewhere in the world as well. Shortly after the US's surrender and the end of the war in 1919, the Ottoman Empire, who were under the occupation of the Entente, rebelled, beginning the Turkish War of Independence. This war would fail miserably for the Turks, who were crushed by 1922. However, the war had also severely and nearly irreversibly crippled Greece and Italy's armies. In the Treaty of Sèvres, their territory was further divided among the Entente. Armenia also managed to gain land, and Kurdistan won its independence. The Turkish rump state that was created after the war would later fall to a communist revolution in 1925. Also in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution led to a civil war which ended in favor of the Communist Red Army. The Bolsheviks officially seized power, and the Soviet Union was founded. And thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, Germany experienced a failed socialist revolution in 1919. While all of this was happening, the United States was going straight down the tubes. They'd been terribly defeated, and their economy made them a complete laughingstock. In times like these, it becomes natural for people to search for something to blame. Soon, many Americans in the North began to label internal mismanagement in the US as the primary reason for their loss in the Great War. Throughout the 20s and 30s, both the Democratic and Republican parties became increasingly unpopular. Many viewed them as too moderate and ineffective in the face of national struggle. This, as always, led to a rise in several extremist factions across the Union, especially of the right. In 1921, the People's Eagle Party, also known as the Black Legion, was founded and began calling for a Second American Revolution, taking inspiration from both the Russian communists and the rising Italian fascists. Then in 1923, the American Union Party, which advocated for the complete annexation of the South into the Union, was founded, with Robert Lincoln as one of its primary members. There was also the American Pure Diamond Party, which was founded in 1924 and was extremely ableist, and dehumanized anyone who was considered physically or mentally disabled. Several more groups like these rose between 1921 and 1928, like the Blue Legion and the Stars and Stripes Army. This made the 1924 elections extremely tumultuous. The Democrats nominated up-and-coming politician Franklin Delano Roosevelt to run against the Republican and incumbent President Calvin Coolidge. There was also a third candidate involved from the People's Eagle Party named Virgil Effinger. Effinger called for the remilitarization of the United States as well as revenge on the South. He also began blaming the Northern Jews and Mormons for the country's loss in the war, and thus most of their issues. Effinger just barely lost the election to Roosevelt, who became the president. Also in 1925, former US President La Follette was found dead in his home in Wisconsin. The local coroner ruled the cause as a suicide. After a later investigation of his home, a note written by him before he died was found, saying that he had betrayed the Union and now had to pay the price for it. The nation itself had a very mixed reaction to this issue, with some mourning his death and others passing him off as a traitor. US President Roosevelt, meanwhile, during his term, failed to get many of his economic reform policies passed due to the extremely divided Congress, causing the US to spiral deeper into recession. Meanwhile in the CS, After the end of his second term, President Wilson decided not to run for a third. After he left office, he was remembered as one of the best new Whig presidents the CS had. In the 1922 election, the new Whigs nominated Joseph T. Robinson. However, he lost against the Southern Democrat William McAdoo. The CS was in the midst of an economic boom when McAdoo became president, and he introduced several progressive policies like ending trade monopolies over Caribbean sugar. All of this brought about a better standard of living in the Confederacy. More was happening elsewhere. A small naval race had begun in the North Pacific and Atlantic between the British, the Japanese, and the Confederates during the late 20s. Also in Russia, which back then was more commonly known as the Soviet Union, the revolutionary leader Vladimir Lenin had passed away. After some brief political shuffling, Leon Trotsky became the new Soviet leader. And finally in Japan, the government, over a decade-long time, began a period of liberalization, transitioning into a full constitutional monarchy similar to the UK. They halted their expansion in Asia and became more of a general peacekeeping force. Despite his approval rating being through the roof, McAdoo didn't run for a second term in 1928 after coming down with typhoid fever, and so the Southern Democrats instead nominated one of his political allies, John M. Parker, who lost against the new Whig candidate Joseph Bailey. Bailey and the new Whigs basically dominated the CS government and were ready to unroll a new wave of reforms. That wasn't until the 1929 stock market crash came around and ruined all the fun. The 29 stock market crash devastated the entire world, especially the US and Germany. The Confederacy, however, also felt the hard pinch. The economy plummeted, and very soon the Southern Democrats began pointing fingers at President Bailey. In 1930, he was impeached by Congress and thrown out of office on charges of corruption. He was then replaced by his VP, James Colescott. President Colescott tried to fix the economic issue. However, when he failed, he defaulted Confederate style and blamed the African American population, resulting in a second rise of Southern hate crimes during the early 1930s. Also in 1930, the Dust Bowl began in the southwestern states and crippled the South. On top of that, in 1931, a splinter cell of the illegal and dying Southern Socialist Party broke away, forming the New Socialist Party. Thanks to the party's radical new beliefs, it grew in popularity in states like Cuba and Georgia. During all of this economic turmoil, an up-and-coming new Whig politician from Louisiana began rising more into the public image. He preached total economic reform and called for a near-complete restructuring of the Confederate monetary system. He also criticized the Colescott administration for causing disunity and called for a more equal but separate way of doing things when it came to race. His views were highly popular, and eventually, in the lead-up to the new Whig Party primaries, members from the New Socialists proposed to Huey Long, offering that he join their party, to which he replied simply, "There's a fine line between reformism and illusion. I may preach change, but I sure as hell am no socialist." When he ran in the 1934 election, he crushed Colescott in a landslide victory, becoming the 14th CS president. The Depression managed to seep its way into Europe. In Germany, the German mark became as good as garbage, and by this point, the German people had had enough of being pushed around by the Entente. In 1933, a fascist extremist called Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party took over the government, and in turn the nation, declaring the Third Reich. This takeover created a lot of inspiration elsewhere. In the US, the situation was at a breaking point. 1935 was one of the worst years on record for crops and harvests. The unemployment rate also reached nearly 35%, and the US dollar had lost nearly all its value. There was a second wave of far-right extremism during the Depression. In 1933, a man called William Dudley Pelley began claiming to be the American Hitler, and soon founded the Silver Legion Party. Between 1933 and 36, a lot of the smaller fascist groups in the US got absorbed into the Legion until they managed to gain a decent following in the eastern states. In the western states, farmers began rallying behind the banner of the Socialist Party. By the 1936 election, there was a clear east-west divide in the US. The Republican Party had also fallen into oblivion by this point, and the Democrats weren't far behind them. In the election itself, the Democrats nominated Al Smith. The Silver Legion Party and the Socialist Party also ran in the election, nominating William Dudley Pelley and Norman Thomas respectively. Norman Thomas and the Socialists just barely won. This loss infuriated Pelley, so on December 3, 1936, Pelly and his Silver Legion marched on Philadelphia, raiding and taking over the U.S. Capitol building. His coup successfully managed to overthrow the U.S. government, and once in power, Pelly declared martial law across the country and the founding of the National Union of America.
This is the BBC. Today, William Dudley Pelly and his Silver Legion have marched on the United States Capitol in Philadelphia, overthrowing the government and declaring the National Union of America. In New York City, thousands have gathered in the streets to celebrate this new American dictatorship, hoping it can fulfill the promises of American greatness they've been hoping on for the past 17 years. In the Confederate States, President Long has expressed his concern over this fascist takeover. The situation in America and mainland Europe has become increasingly dire, with more nations turning to extremism. Pelly, the new dictator of America, has also expressed his support for Adolf Hitler and his new German Reich. In a recent speech, he's also promised absolute revenge on the so-called traitors in California and Deseret, as well as the absolute destruction of the Confederate States and our empire. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin has yet to address the country on this shocking event.
The Socialists retaliated quickly, with riots breaking out in the Rust Belt and Midwestern states just 2 days after the coup. These riots escalated to open conflict between the Socialists and the new Legionary Army. By December 12th, a civil war had been declared between the Socialists in the Rust Belt and the Legionists. There were also small pockets of the remaining Loyalist U.S. Army, however they were crushed very quickly. A wave of northern refugees began to escape to the CS in Canada as the Legion slowly pushed through the Rust Belt. By March of 1937, the Socialist Army was on the run and were pushed all the way back to Indiana from both sides before finally surrendering in May. The leaders of the Socialist Party were all executed, and the Silver Legion had secured their domain over the country. Over the course of the next few months, several purges would take place in the National Union. These purges were mostly directed at Jews, Mormons, and suspected Southern sympathizers. The Army and the Navy of the North was also greatly expanded. The NUA was also quick to ally themselves with Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and eventually Fascist Spain. The rest of the world panicked. In a speech in Congress, CS President Long called the Silver Legion a group of scheming political pirates, while the UK completely cut off trade with the northern states. In 1937, the Allied Pact formed between the British, the French, and the CS and the Japanese. By 1938, with the German annexation of Austria, the rise of the Axis powers became extremely concerning, and the new British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, wanted to make an attempt to calm down the Germans and Americans, so he proposed the idea of appeasing them. In 1938, the Allies struck a deal with the Axis, allowing Germany to annex the Sudetenland and handing the territories of Maine and Oregon back to the NUA. In return, the Axis had to promise not to resume hostilities with the Allied Pact. They agreed, and Chamberlain declared a peace for their time, which only lasted for around 6 months when Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. Surprisingly, Britain and France, though angry, were slow to retaliate. The NUA took advantage of this, and in August of 1939 declared war and invaded Deseret. Not long after, the Germans made an agreement with the Soviet Union to invade Poland and divide the country. The Allies had had enough. In September, the UK and France declared war on Germany, and in response, the NUA declared war on the UK. The CS sent aid to the British, but initially didn't join in just yet, and thus began the Second World War. The National Union steamrolled through Deseret, taking the country in only 2 months. They then invaded California in December. The Germans also invaded the lowland countries and France. It's worth pointing out that Italy tried to invade North Africa and the Balkans, but due to their extremely crippled and terrible economy and army, the Germans had to help them with nearly every operation. Both California and France capitulated to their respective invaders by May of 1941. By September, the Germans had ambitions to invade the British Isles and take down the British hegemony over Europe once and for all, so they launched Operation Sea Lion. The Germans, however, failed to win the aerial battle with Britain over the Channel, and so the invasion was called off. The new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, referred to it as Britain's finest hour. British and Canadian forces also managed to hold off the National Union forces, with Canada even making gains in Montana. Everything seemed to be going well for the Allies until this happened.
Good evening. Welcome to CSBC. Today, the National American Union has launched a surprise bombing attack on several cities across the Confederate States, them being Richmond, Memphis, Lexington, Baltimore, Charlotte, and Charleston. The exact death toll is still unknown, as parts of these cities have been reduced to rubble. We're also told they've destroyed several CS military bases on the border.
December 19th became a day that would live in infamy in the South, as many southern cities and bases were flattened by the Silver Legion Air Force. According to various sources, a few minutes prior to the attack, Supreme President Pelly held a massive military parade in New York City where he swore to end the Confederacy before promptly declaring war on them and launching an attack. President Huey Long, who had just won re-election roughly a month prior, made a speech the day after the attack to Congress, who had all been moved temporarily from Richmond to a secure location. The National Union of America is a nation of cold-hearted warmongers. They have shown that they cannot maintain peace at all. So we shall stand up to defend our allies from them. Our country is officially at war, and we will do everything in our power to win. CS President Huey Long, 1940. The CS Army attempted an invasion of Kansas, though that failed horribly. In February of 1941, the National Union's army began an invasion through the Mississippi River. They also started to invade Maryland and Delaware, which would both fall quickly. The CS Army managed to hold off the NUA around the Virginian border. In June, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union, and in September, the French Québécois living in Quebec, Canada started an anti-war rebellion against the British. This was amazing news for the Americans, as more British troops were taken off the front to sort out the rebels. The Legionary Army sliced through Canada, taking Ottawa by January of 1942. Also, in December of 1941, the NUA, fearing that the Japanese may come to the aid of the Allies, decided to take out the Japanese Navy in the Pacific, and on the morning of December 7th, the American Air Force launched an attack on Crown Prince Harbor in Japanese Hawaii. Japan then declared war on the NUA. However, due to most of their navy being destroyed, they weren't prepared to face them. To make a long story short, between 1942 and 45, the NUA's navy pushed back and humiliated the Japanese across the Pacific in a slow campaign they called island hopping. Japan also began suffering in Asia. China had been going through a civil war between the communists and the nationalists. The Germans and Americans agreed to aid the nationalist KMT in exchange for them joining the Axis against the Japanese. They agreed, and the Chinese communists were crushed by 1943. Things weren't looking too good for the Confederates either. Thanks to all their victories in Canada, more northern troops were sent to the front. The NUA also sent troops into Stuart, meaning the CS was now being invaded from 3 different points. Very soon, their supply line began to run dry. The Legionary Army steamed down the Mississippi. They also managed to capture Los Angeles. The Confederate defensive line in Virginia finally broke in October of 1942. In no time, Richmond was threatened, and the remnants of the CS government had to be moved down to Tallahassee in Florida. By now, it was very clear to the Allies that the Axis truly meant business, and their armies were much stronger than anticipated. With the extra aid from the Americans, the Nazis also managed to capture the Soviet capital of Moscow in December of 41. Trotsky and most of the Soviet government had already fled to Omsk when they arrived, and the nation's capital was moved there. Despite the fact that Moscow had fallen, the Soviets didn't surrender, and small-scale fighting still continued along the Ural Mountains. Meanwhile, the British had been kicked out of Egypt by the Germans. The British home islands themselves, however, were defended vigorously. During all of this, the NUA was winning victory after victory. By the end of 1943, the Confederate capital of Richmond had been taken, as well as the Mississippi River, basically starving the country. Most of Canada had also been taken. The American island hopping campaign saw the NUA absorb basically every island the Japanese and the British owned in the Pacific Ocean. As part of a much bigger plan called Operation Spider, the Americans also wanted to take New Zealand and Australia, but the invasion was called off before it started due to them being heavily defended. By 1944, the South knew that they were done for. After the Legionary armies pushed to the sea, the NUA carried out paratrooper landings over the Caribbean and the Yucatan. The seizure of the northern Mexican states also allowed the National Union to launch an invasion of Mexico. In late 1944, with the NUA occupying all of the CS's Atlantic and Pacific coasts, Texas attempted to gain independence. They failed, and instead they were trampled by the Legionary Army. During all this, the Confederate colonies of Fredonia and Namibia managed to break free from the CS. In January of 1945, The British realized that further conflict against the Axis was futile, and, with Canada gone and India rebelling, they surrendered to them, pulling out of the war. Next, the CS surrendered that May, and President Long evacuated the country, forming a government in exile in Britain. The only stragglers left among the Allies were the Japanese and the Soviets, but even they wouldn't last. On the morning of July 31st, 1945, the Germans dropped a single bomb over the Russian city of Perm, where most of the military was stationed. This bomb was like nothing humanity had ever seen before. Perm was flattened in an instant. A few days later, the NUA dropped one of these magic firebombs on the city of Hiroshima in Japan. Later, another Japanese city, Nagasaki, was hit. The world was shocked. A name was given for these destructive devices: atom bombs. They had the ability to decimate entire cities and countries, and both the Germans and Americans were ready to use them again at any time. The Japanese and the Soviets, fearful of more bombs, had no choice but to surrender to the Fascists. The Second World War ended in an Axis victory, and the North had finally, after 84 years of Confederate independence, triumphed over the South. The post-war Treaty of Paris saw France regain independence as a German puppet state, as well as an expansion of Germany's borders. Western Russia was also carved up into multiple Reichskommissariats. The rest of the Soviet Union survived east of the Urals as the Siberian Soviet Socialist Republic, or the Triple SR for short. The Triple SR quickly became a hermit state. Korea regained independence as a Chinese client nation, while Japan came under the occupation of the NUA. The NUA also fully annexed Canada, Japanese Hawaii, and the Confederate States, including the Caribbean and the Yucatan, while Mexico just became a puppet. Out of the treaty, Italy also managed to forge themselves a small empire in the Balkans. Britain was allowed to stay independent with the monarchy intact, however they had to give India independence and pay reparations to the Germans and Americans. The Channel Islands also had to remain under German occupation. The majority of the world in only 7 years had fallen under the thumb of the Axis powers, and most of all, the Americans had triumphed over their southern neighbor who had humiliated them for nearly a century. But the NUA had very little time to celebrate. Besides the fact that both them and Germany had the keys to the world's destruction, they also had a massive continental empire filled with rebellious people from annexed countries. As they say in war rooms, invading nations is one thing, holding them is another.